Now, in the south, you had Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was in South Africa. South Africa had a lot of gold.
A lot of gold.
And lots of gold, and still does. So we still find gold in Zimbabwe. When the Western world got bigger and didn't have enough gold, we rediscovered gold in Africa, and it temporarily relieved the shortage of gold. Now, of course, today we don't trade in silver and gold coins. Trading is a matter of, was until a matter of paper money. Today, trading is a matter of a card, a plastic card. Be that as it may, folk, I mean, I look for the day to come when all of a sudden the plastic cards don't work, when the computers don't work. It could easily happen, and here's how. If the sun hit us the wrong way, it could wipe out all of our solid state devices. Or if one of our enemies sent a spike of high-powered, high-voltage electricity at a high-voltage radio wave, it could also zap out all of our electronic devices. Some of you know like you've heard this before. And instantly, folk, we're back in the Stone Age.
We'll survive.
We'll survive, yes. But hey, how many of you know how to plant a garden in your own backyard? I mean, okay, I do, a few of us. Oh yes, it sounds easy. Taking care of it can be a pain. But anyway,
You have to have a battle sword.
all right. But anyway, Zimbabwe, the city of Zimbabwe was eventually abandoned, and we don't know why. And your book has all kinds of theories, like the same thing with the Maya. Maybe they over-farmed and they farmed to the point where the land no longer produced. They didn't know about fertilizers. Or maybe the rains quit falling for a while. But whatever, this Zimbabwe was abandoned, never to reassemble as a nation. And eventually then what happened? In all these civilizations, as they declined, Ethiopia did manage to survive into modern time, but most of these states degenerated. I hate to use that word degenerated, but I don't know what other word to use, but they went into a tribal system. Tribal, what your book calls stateless people, where they didn't have a king, didn't have a central government, a tribe that consisted maybe of 200 to 300 people. Well, when the tribe got large, they split up. And the tribe got larger and they split up. And they simply, some of these stateless people would eventually cooperate with each other and start to merge when they realized that being stateless made them ripe for slavery. If Africa would have had a big nation with a very powerful king, this king would have been able to stop the slave trade, but as it was, since they did not have a powerful king, the slave trade went on in Africa and did a lot to depopulate. In some places, your book says more than half of the Africans were taken out of Africa and taken to the New World and as slaves. Again, this is standard history. Now, all right, their religion, they believed generally in a creator God. This was similar to European Gnosticism, but the creator God had brought forth a pantheon of lesser gods. So underneath the really high God was a bunch of lesser gods, and these lesser gods were the ones that we generally associated with, because the creator God was too high up or too busy to notice us. This was their view now. The American Indians did the same thing. Ancestor worship, extremely important. They memorized the names of their ancestors for at least 50 years back. If I say 50 years, I mean 50 generations. They memorized names of ancestors for at least 50 generations back. And they passed down their tradition and history by oral means, but it was by word of mouth. They didn't have writing. So they passed down their history by word of mouth from one generation to another. The way they communicated with their gods was by music or by ritual. They get together and they use drum beats to call up the spirits. Or now, this is surprising to a lot of students, but the Africans had the xylophone, but they had stringed instruments, and they had drums, and they'd use their instruments to get the right notes, the right rhythm together, and suppose this rhythm would help them call up the spirits and communicate with the gods. Eventually, a lot of them embraced Islam. All right. In the area of family life, they had fewer taboos between men and women than a lot of other societies did. Polygamy, and this was what made it conflict with both Christianity and Islam, polygamy was the norm. Every woman who could had more than one husband, and every man who could had more than one wife. Now, in some African societies, a man could only pass his inheritance to his sister's children. And you might wonder why his sister's children, because everyone knew who the mother was. But sometimes the father was difficult to determine, so a man would know a woman was his sister if they had the same mother. So if a woman was your sister, both you and she had the same mother. So if you were a man and you died, your inheritance would go to your sister's children. That way you could be sure it would stay in the family. Because again, you could not be sure of who the father was.
Is that the whole,
Just some African societies, not all, but some. And but not all. Matriarchy. This is a society where a woman is the head. A lot of African societies were matriarchies, where they were ruled by women. Again, each of you can decide for yourself whether this is bad or good, but a lot of your African societies are ruled by women. And this is true of a lot of tribal societies, by the way. All right, art and music. Their art had a lot of emphasis on sculpture, and especially as time went on, paintings fell by the wayside in favor of sculpture. And a lot of their sculptures depicted the human face, but they did not try to achieve realism like some of the Greeks did, but they tried to depict the human face with what you might call unreal. All right. A lot of emphasis on culture. Their music, and this is still true, folk. African music is known for its heavy rhythmic beat. And if you're driving along and you stop at a red light and you hear a heavy rhythmic beat coming from a car nearby, inside is probably an African person. All right.
no,
Okay, maybe it's not. All right. No, I've had more than one African take offense at that, but I mean, what's wrong with African people like music with a heavy rhythmic drum beat? You don't know. If you don't, fine and dandy.
Nah,
You don't, you do.
that beat gotta be hard.
All right. Heavy rhythmic beat. All right.
Words don't matter if the beat.
Now, they did, again, I want to mention that some of you see on the test, they did have the xylophone. They did have stringed instruments also. They had the stringed instrument, they had the xylophone.
Really did actually.
And they had, of course, the drum. The drums were often made out of a hollowed out log, of a part of a log, with some kind of skin tied on the top of it, African drum.
How do you, excuse me.
All right, yes.
How do you spell
How do I spell what? Xylophone. X-Y-L, the A-P-H-O-N-E, I believe. X-Y-L.
Two L's out on
It's an O, not an A.
Somebody's looking it up.
XYL.
X-Y-L, yeah.
X-Y-L-L-P-H-O-N-E.
P-H-O-N-E, all right. Thank you. All right, now, okay. All right. One thing, as I was looking over the test, and I looked over the test before I came to class, one thing I want you to know that I don't think I mentioned, one of the diseases that the Europeans carried to the New World. Oops, T-Y.
Everything.
T-Y-P-H-U-N.
They brought everything.
Typhoid fever.
Yes.
Now, typhoid fever, I mean, heck, in 1926, my grandma Cunningham died of it just before her 28th birthday. So it was a serious problem. Today, hopefully all of you have been vaccinated against it, or vaccination against typhus is included as part of the standard. And when I joined the Army, I had to take all those vaccinations again, because it's now known that these vaccinations do not last a whole lifetime. We used to think they did, but I was vaccinated twice against smallpox, once when I was 5 and once when I was 30. And twice against typhus. Again, typhoid fever. These typhus germs were really deadly, but that's one of the diseases that the Europeans passed on.
It goes on. It goes on. How they gonna come take over and then get everybody sick?
How they gonna come take over but
All right.
think you're superior? I wanna understand how that's supposed to work.
Because they had guns.
You have guns.
Now,
But if you didn't, if the Indians were here, they would have died of starvation.
the people, desert people who wander around, I mean, I mentioned they're the Bedouins. Bedouins live in Arabia, in the Middle East, in Syria, and a lot of them live in North Africa. They tend to be wandering. B-E-D-O-U.
Oh, that, see?
Yeah, Mohammed was one at the start of his life. They believed that a person should be poor. All right, now another group of people I think I've failed to mention. The first Europeans whom we have documented that came over here were the Vikings. The Vikings were from Scandinavia, and they came about the year 1000. Now, first the Vikings crossed the Atlantic and discovered Iceland. Then they went on over across and discovered Greenland. Then some of them went on even farther and went to Nova Scotia. We have found their colonies in both Greenland and Nova Scotia. The year 1000 is believed to have been a really, really hot period of time in European history. Hot, and the climate was hot. Then came the 1200s when the climate cooled abruptly, and the Vikings could not handle the cooling. And here's the sad part of the story. If only the Vikings would have made friends with the Eskimos knew how to handle that climate. Instead, the Vikings perished. The ones living in the New World all perished off. Now, in Iceland, they survived, but in Greenland, they all died off. In Nova Scotia, they bumped into the Indians. The Vikings did have iron helmets and iron swords, but the Indians greatly outnumbered them. This was before the Indian population greatly declined, and the Vikings were no match. So the Vikings stayed on Nova Scotia for 10 years, then packed up and moved back to Greenland. Again, there's no match. All right, I'll tell you, here's the story. It was believed if you met someone who was of different ethnic group than you, if you scratched him and he bled, he was human. If he didn't bleed, he was a demon. Suppose, all right, an Indian went into the Viking town where the Vikings had built a wall, and they didn't know, is this a Skraeling or not, which was their word for demon, foreign spirit. So they scratched him up pretty deeply, and he bled. They said, well, he must be human, but it made all the Indian people angry at him. So the Indians began to rise up and kill a few Vikings, and the Vikings realized there were no match. And they could not speak each other's language. So this time it was the Vikings, the Europeans, who got up and moved out. Now, 500 years later, the Europeans came with big ships and with heavy cannon and with heavy armor that the Vikings didn't have, and rifles also that the Vikings didn't have. And the Indians were no match. But the initial conflict went to the Indians. But the Vikings came in. We'll talk about them again when we come to chapter 13. They were from Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. Some of the Viking heroes were Leif Erikson. And Eric the Red was a father, and Leif Erikson was a son. Eric the Red was born and died a pagan, but his son, Leif Erikson, became a Christian. Again, because Christianity was becoming a fashion among the Norwegian people, the people of Norway and Sweden. Leif Erikson committed some kind of, well, not Leif, Eric the Red committed some kind of a crime against the Viking people and had to flee, so he fled to Greenland for a while.
That's not, should we know this?
What's that?
Should we know this part? The Viking part?
No, just know that, be aware, there is one question that you might see and might not. There is one question on the test on the Vikings. Know this, they came from Scandinavia.
Oh,
And they were the first white people we know of to come to the New World. Now, it has now been proven, what other people have suspected, that between the time of the Vikings and the time of Columbus, ships crossed the Atlantic constantly for fishing purposes, and some of them landed, and some of them traded with Indians, and some of them associated with Indians, and they gave the Indians diseases like smallpox and typhus. And this was what made the Indians more easy to be conquered when the English came in the 1600s. And the French came also at that time. The Indian population was greatly declined. And the diseases probably were European diseases that were spread by these fishermen who had crossed the Atlantic. And not just fish, but trade. And they would, again, you might say, how come the rest of Europe didn't know about this? Keep in mind, folks, there were no telephones, there was no internet, there were no telegraphs. So a fisherman, a sea captain would go away for several months, and nobody would say, well, he's going to this land way, way, way on the other side of the ocean. Nobody knew what he was, and he'd go fish a bit, dry out the fish he caught, and bring them back home, and everybody would celebrate with a big feast. This is now known, but again, these people who did it were mostly poor, and they did not attract the attention of the kings. But now when the Vikings came, kings were not involved. But when Columbus came, you may know he got his ships from the most powerful king and queen of Europe. And then the same king and queen sent 17 ships on the next trip. And the rest, they say, is history. The Europeans came in numbers that just overwhelmed the Indians, and they had technology that the Indians didn't have. And the Indians proved to be no match for them. All right.
when did diamonds came in the trade?
Diamonds? Oh, well, I'll be honest with you, I don't know. I know that the diamond trade is part of African trade. I don't know if they were trading in old times or not. Your book doesn't mention them. But I do know that in the 1800s, diamonds was a big issue in African trade. Huge. People would go to Africa for gold and for diamonds. Now, whether it was that way in the olden times, I really don't know. I would guess it was, but then again, that Africa has more natural formed diamonds than any place on earth. Now, speaking of diamonds, we now know how to make diamonds artificially, and I'll be honest, I don't know how you can tell the difference. If any of you know, I might want to be enlightened.
It's an enlightened thing.
But anyway, they make them artificially now. All right. Half the test will be on Islam, know what the Hijra was, the flight that Muhammad made. The holy book is the Quran.